Hi there. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. As always, happy whatever day it is. Welcome to Left Side of the Aisle. I'm your host. My name is Larry Erickson, and for the next almost half hour, I'm going to be ranting away at some things that I think are important and that you should know about. Comments, questions, or reactions are always welcome. They can be sent to me directly. My personal email is whoviating, W-H-O-V as in Victor, I-A-T-I-N-G at AOL.com, or you can go to my website, Lotus Surviving a Dark Time, and the URL will be around here somewhere a couple of times during the show. You can go get the email address from there, or you can leave a comment there if you'd like. If you do send me email, please include something in the subject line that makes it clear that this is not spam, and be a little patient about getting an answer because I stink at answering email. So with that, we'll get to it. And this show actually is going to be a little bit unusual because it's really a bunch of anniversaries to discuss. That's the primary thing here. So we're going to start with that by giving a happy, slightly belated birthday to Medicare. Medicare just turned 50, the bill to establish the program having been signed into law on July 30th, 1965. In the years since, it has become so much a part of our social fabric that people tend to forget just what it is, which is government-guaranteed health insurance. In fact, they forget to the point where, and no, it was not a joke, during the debate over the Affordable Care Act, there were Tea Party types who actually were with signs saying some version of, "Keep your government hands off my Medicare." Now, in another way, though, I suppose that's not a surprise because, as Paul Krugman pointed out, right-wingers hate Medicare. They've hated it from the beginning because it's a government program that offers sort of a universal protection, and they hate it even more because it works. In fact, Medicare has been a remarkable success. According to the New York Times, before Medicare, almost half of people over 65 had no health insurance. That figure now is about 2%. And analysts say that between 1970 and 2010, by enabling early access to medical care, Medicare contributed to a 5-year increase in life expectancy at age 65, which I'd call that a pretty impressive achievement. Now, these aren't the only achievements it's racked up. Is also, for one example, reduced poverty among the elderly by reducing the burden of overwhelming health care costs. So it's reaching 50, one of those nice round numbers that we love so much. That's a cause for celebration. So happy birthday, Medicare. And as a sort of footnote to that, I also note there's another anniversary related to this because the same legislation that established Medicare also established Medicaid. Medicaid, which of course is geared primarily towards the poor, and so it too has just turned 50. Unhappily, Medicaid has been neither as popular nor as successful as Medicare. One reason is that it is, again, geared mostly to the poor. And that is always a hard sell in the United States, where we seem to regard being poor as a sign of some sort of moral inferiority. The other problem is that it's administered by the states, who have enormous leeway in deciding who is eligible for coverage, and some states are downright miserly. The result is that millions of people cannot get coverage to which they should be entitled. Even so, again, according to the New York Times, over its life, Medicaid, quote, has been critical in reducing childhood deaths and infant mortality. It has saved the lives of patients with chronic conditions like heart disease, diabetes, and asthma. If Medicaid did not exist, the life expectancy in America would be much lower. And that is something else that's worth celebrating. So, happy birthday, Medicaid. I have to take a slight detour from this for a quick Clown Award because it just fits in so well here. Clown Award is given here, as always, for an act of meritorious stupidity. And while this does seem like shooting at a very big fish in a very small barrel, it is just so appropriate here that this year I have to give the big red nose to Jeb Bush. Speaking at an Americans for Prosperity event in Manchester, New Hampshire recently, Jeb please don't anybody say my last name because I don't want you to remember that I'm associated with that loser, said that, quote, we need to figure out a way to phase out this program, that is Medicare, for anyone who is not yet in the system, and move to a new system, quote unquote. He said this while praising Representative Paul Ranton's proposal, which replaced Medicare with vouchers to help pay the premiums for whichever health plan a particular individual chose from a menu of private plans. In other words, the Jeb man wants to get rid of Medicare and replace it with a system of government subsidies for purchase of private medical insurance. Jeb, isn't that Obamacare? Jeb as big a loser as his brother Bush. What a clown. All right, we have another anniversary to note, another 50th anniversary. This must have been one hell of a week back in 1965. This birthday is that of a law that in its own way has had as much of an impact on our society as Medicare has. It was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which was signed into law August 6th of that year. It's been amended and expanded several times in the years since and has enabled untold numbers of minority citizens, mostly but not entirely in the South, to be able to register and to vote, many for the first time. It has been called the single most effective piece of civil rights legislation ever passed by Congress. Or that is, it was until 2013 when the Supreme Court declaring in essence that when it comes to voting, racism just doesn't exist anymore, gutted enforcement of central provisions of the Act. Since then, there have been repeated attempts to undo the damage by the court's reactionary majority, every one of which has been stymied because there are too many people both in and out of Congress who benefit by having the franchise limited and voter suppression enabled. This year, proponents hope to use the occasion of the anniversary to increase the pressure to repair the harm done by the court, and there are events around the country surrounding the anniversary date. Now, personally, I have to admit that I have no faith that the right wing will be moved by any of this because they are as impervious to moral suasion as they are to logical argument. But then again, I could be wrong. I have been before. Let's hope I am again. And in any event, happy 50th birthday to the Voting Rights Act. Finally, before we go to break, I'm going to make some, oh my gosh, happy announcements. And this is all personal indulgences, but it's my show and it's my time and I think I've earned it. Number one, Dan Perkins, a.k.a. Tom Tomorrow, whose satirical comic strip This Modern World is turning 25 this year, is going to be bringing out a 2-volume collection of every strip he's ever done. It'll probably cost more than I can afford, but maybe I can talk the library into getting one because, after all, he was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize in editorial cartooning this year. Number two, and what may prove to be an embarrassment of riches, something that has been missing for those 25 years, is coming back. Berkeley Breathed is bringing back Bloom County. And to top it off, you may recall that I reported a couple of months ago that Fox is bringing back The X-Files with the original cast for a 6-episode run. We now learn that the trio of conspiracy geek computer hackers known as the Lone Gunmen will be part of the series. My cup runneth over. We're taking a break. And we're back. And I have one other anniversary I'm going to talk about this week. This one not nearly so happy as some of the others. This week marks the 70th anniversary of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. During the week there will be, if past experience is any guide, a few news stories recalling the events, a few photographs of paper cranes over the monument in Hiroshima's Peace Park, a few "it must not happen again" editorials, still expressing appropriate sadness at the necessity of the bombings. It will, in short, be a week of comforting, reinforcing oft-told tales of myths. And that's perhaps more fitting than we realize, because the nuclear weapons age was born in a myth, the myth of the Nazi bomb. Most people date the start of the American nuclear arms efforts to a famous 1939 letter written by Dr. Leo Szilard, but was sent to President Roosevelt over the signature of Albert Einstein because it was thought that his signature would be more impressive. The letter noted the possibility of developing an atomic bomb. In fact, by the time of Pearl Harbor, the U.S. already had an atomic bomb project going, which had already made some progress. Now, the political argument for building the bomb, for investing enormous amounts of time, energy, money, resources, and scientific talent into what became known as the Manhattan Project, was that some intelligence reports said that Nazi Germany was working along similar lines. And if they were going to have a bomb, we had to have one, and we had to have it first. Now, although it must in fairness be noted that it may not have been known at the time, the fact is that although the Germans were doing some experiments in that direction, they were going about it in an extremely inefficient way, and it would have taken them decades to have built a bomb if, in fact, it was possible at all. Now, some of late have tried to resuscitate the threat of the Nazi bomb by claiming the Germans were closer than we knew. The argument, however, is based on their progress in enriching uranium, and relies on the supposition that in the mid-1940s that the scientists working on the German nuclear project would suddenly change direction and start adopting a completely different methodology that they had rejected years before. At least one writer to this has added the argument that a commando raid that destroyed a uranium enrichment facility in occupied Norway set back the Germans' bomb project significantly to the point where it prevented the Nazis from getting the bomb. Now, that raid undoubtedly did slow production, but it didn't affect the problem of the bomb design. Having more enriched uranium doesn't help you if the way you're trying to construct the bomb is inefficient and won't work. The closer than we knew assertions are based on a series of what-ifs, which makes for interesting speculation, but not for persuasive argument. But no matter what you think on that point, what's important here is that it was the claimed threat from Germany that supposedly provided the logic, the argument, the purpose of the Manhattan Project. And yet, by late 1944, U.S. intelligence knew that the German nuclear experiments had failed. The Manhattan Project didn't even slow down. In fact, Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945. That was 10 weeks before the first successful test of a nuclear weapon. That test, codenamed Trinity, took place on July 16, 1945 at the Alamogordo testing range, 230 miles south of Los Alamos, New Mexico. With the surrender of Germany, the entire founding logic of the Manhattan Project evaporated. It vanished. It dissolved. But the project by then had too much momentum. It had become its own end, its own purpose, its own logic. So instead of stopping or even slowing down, the project actually accelerated. In part because some of the scientists involved were afraid that the war would end before they were able to finish the bomb. So as justification, we simply switched myths, from the myth of the Nazi atomic bomb to the myth of the fanatical Japanese. The weapon that was supposedly designed for defense against Germany now had to be used on Japan. And here is what is probably the most important myth of all, because it provided the logical, if you can call it that, the logical underpinnings for actually carrying out the destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for actually vaporizing tens of thousands of people in the flash of an instant, and for opening the door to the atomic age. This is a myth that gets replayed, reproduced, repronounced, reproclaimed every time Hiroshima and Nagasaki are mentioned. A myth that people continue to believe today, as Gallup polls show that a majority of Americans approve of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on this basis. It is the myth that the Japanese were so fanatical that the only alternative to the atomic bombings was a bloody and protracted land invasion of Japan. It's just not true. It's more than a myth. It's worse than a myth. It's a damned lie. A 70-year-old damned lie. To begin with, the yearly claims, which are probably going to be heard again this week, that such an invasion would have cost 250,000 or 500,000 or 1 million American lives, the numbers vary kind of unpredictably, is utter nonsense. In fact, even President Truman originally cited a number of 250,000 casualties, not deaths, casualties, dead and injured. But in later years, he redoubled that figure, and then he doubled it again for no discernible reason and no discernible basis. More to the point, the War Planning Committee, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, predicted at the time that no more than 40,000 American deaths, and thought it might have been as low as 20,000 because they suspected that Japan might have surrendered during the first part of such a campaign. Now, 20,000 is a lot of people. Then again, it's about 1/7 to 1/10 the amount of death which we inflicted on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which in turn raises the more important question of whether such an invasion was necessary at all. It wasn't. By the spring of 1945, Japan was already a defeated nation. It had no longer had any navy to speak of. Its air force had been decimated. Its armed forces had been driven back to its own shores. It was incapable of mounting any offensive actions or even defending itself against U.S. air raids. Critical supplies, even food, were in short supply. The situation was so bad that even attempts to justify the bombings wind up just showing how desperate Japan's condition really was. Several years ago, I got into an online argument with somebody who wanted to justify the bombings by raising the specter of a Japan bristling with military forces, which would make a land invasion incredibly bloody. At one point, to show the determination of the Japanese to defend their homeland at any cost whatsoever, he said, and I'm quoting him here, Japan pulled some 500 loaded ships out of China and not one of them made it back to Japan because of attacks from U.S. bombers. In response, I noted that he thereby, if unintentionally, admitted just how bad Japan's condition was, since its air force was so decimated that it could not even provide air cover for its own retreating troops. In fact, the situation was so bad that before Hiroshima, Japan had already made secret overtures through Sweden and the Soviet Union to surrender. All this was known to the U.S. military. All this was known to President Truman, who rejected the offer because it wasn't unconditional. The Japanese wanted Hirohito to retain his position as emperor. What was also known to Truman, however, is the USSR's intent to declare war on Japan and its likely impact. In his journal about his meetings with Stalin at the Potsdam Conference, Truman wrote, this is July 17, 1945, his journal during the conference, he wrote, quote, he'll be, referring to Stalin, he'll be in Japan war on August 15th, finny Japs when that comes about, quote unquote. The atomic bombings were simply unnecessary, but we refused to accept the idea, refused even to accept surrender, because by then peace wasn't enough, even victory wasn't enough. It had to be utter, smashing, devastating, total victory. So it was that early on the morning of August 6, 1945, the B-29 superfortress, nicknamed Enola Gay, took off from the Tinian Air Force Base on Tinian Island in the Pacific Ocean and headed for Hiroshima, a Japanese city of about 250,000 people. It carried a single bomb, codenamed Little Boy. At 8:15 a.m. local time, Little Boy was dropped. I want to pause for a moment to give you a sense of the kind of power we're talking about. The bomb contained 64 kilograms, about 141 pounds, of highly enriched fissionable uranium. Of that amount, only about 7/10 of a kilogram, about 1.5 pounds, actually fissioned. That is, the atoms actually split. And only about 600 milligrams was actually converted into energy. That 600 milligrams equals about a little more than 1/50th of an ounce. The energy released by that 1/50th of an ounce had the explosive force of 14,000 tons of dynamite. It was enough to devastate Hiroshima. Around 70,000 people died instantly. Some of them were literally vaporized. Another 20,000 died shortly thereafter, some thousands more by 1950 due to injuries, radiation poisoning, and cancer. Just 3 days later, another nuclear bomb, codenamed Fat Man, did the same to the city of Nagasaki, with tens of thousands more dead, thousands more condemned to die of injuries, radiation poisoning, and cancer, and another city destroyed. So we destroyed Hiroshima, and then we destroyed Nagasaki when Japan didn't surrender fast enough. We destroyed them even though many U.S. officials and top military officers, including such as William Leahy and Admiral William Leahy and Generals Dwight Eisenhower, Hap Arnold, and Douglas MacArthur, said it was unnecessary. And that judgment was proved correct by U.S. analysts who were sent to Japan in 1946, who concluded that Japan would have surrendered before November 1st, 1945, quote, even if atomic bombs hadn't been dropped, Russia hadn't entered the war, and no invasion was planned. Bombing Hiroshima was unnecessary, and the U.S. government and military knew it was unnecessary. It was a crime, a war crime we compounded, more than doubled, by bombing Nagasaki before the impact of the first bomb had time to settle in. The Nagasaki bomb was made ready in a 3-day, day and night effort, and Nagasaki wasn't even the primary target. In fact, a city called Kokura was. In fact, Nagasaki was not even on the original list of the 3 targets for the second bomb. And ultimately only wound up getting bombed because there was too much cloud cover over Kokura that day for a clear bomb run. Which raises the question of whether or not the bombing of Nagasaki was to force Japan to surrender or to get it in before it had a chance to. There is good reason to think the latter. Truman's comment about finny Japs when the Soviets entered the war against Japan was not enthusiasm. It was a reflection of his concern over the possibility of Soviet influence in a post-war world and about how we could counter and prevent that. Before the bombing, some officials urged that we stage a demonstration blast on a deserted island or in an uninhabited area of Japan to show the Japanese the power of the weapon that we had and to give them a chance to surrender before we actually used it. Among those pushing for such an idea, in fact, was Leo Szilard, who, perhaps having second thoughts about his role in all this, pleaded with Secretary of State James Burns, seen here with President Truman. He pleaded with Burns not to use the bomb on people, and he circulated a petition to Truman to rule out its use because it would open, quote, the door to an era of devastation on an unimaginable scale. The idea of a demonstration blast was supposedly shelved, but in fact the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were demonstration blasts. They were intended to show the awesome power we held in our arsenal, only the target of the demonstration wasn't Japan, it was the Soviet Union. U.S. officials, including Burns and Presidential Advisor Bernard Baruch, and top military leaders had urged the use of atomic weapons on Japan as a means of warning the Soviet Union not to challenge American plans for its hegemony in a post-war world. The purpose was, in Burns' words, to allow the U.S. to, quote, dictate our own terms at the end of the war and make Russia more manageable in Europe, by showing our power and our willingness to use it. Which means, ultimately, hundreds of thousands of Japanese were destroyed, disintegrated as sacrificial lambs at the start of a decades-long campaign to contain the Soviets, if not bully them into submission. From Nazi bomb scientists through wild-eyed Japanese fanatics through intractable Soviet deceivers, the myth makers had constructed an image of the United States as appropriated, as appointed as if by God, to protect and shape the world with the atomic bomb, as President Truman put it, the weapon given to us by God that we were to use, quote, for his purposes and his ends. The bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were not the last shots of World War II. They were the first shots of the Cold War and the Japanese its first victims. Now, one bitter note on this, one bitter footnote. 2 days after the bombing of Nagasaki, Japan surrendered. Now, whether or not the bombings actually ended the war can be argued, because on August 8th, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and attacked Manchukuo, a Japanese puppet state on the mainland of Asia. Manchukuo, I should say. That has led some to claim that it was that and not the atomic bombings that actually precipitated Japan's surrender. Remember Truman's comment about finny Japs when the Russians attack. But what I wanted to make here is to point out that those terms of surrender that were ultimately accepted were essentially identical to those which Japan offered before the bombings of Hiroshima, including Hirohito remaining as emperor. This means that the last several weeks of World War II were a complete and utter waste of time, energy, resources, and life. Finally for today, as a footnote for all of that, why that's not just a history lesson. According to the Arms Control Association, as of July 2015, the United States has 1,600 strategic nuclear weapons deployed, plus another 2,800 in reserve, along with tactical short-range nuclear weapons that number about 500. Russia also has about 1,600 strategic warheads deployed, several thousand more undeployed, and approximately 2,000 tactical nuclear weapons. France has 290 deployed nuclear warheads. China has about 250. The United Kingdom has 120 strategic warheads, of which 40 are deployed at sea at any given time. Its total stockpile is up to 225. India has between 90 and 110 nuclear weapons. Israel has somewhere between 80 and 100, with fissile material for up to 200. Pakistan holds between 100 and 120 nuclear weapons. North Korea is estimated to have 5 or 6. Nuclear weapons are very real and continue to be very real, and the threat continues to be very real. We've been comforted over the past several years by the fact that the arsenals of the two biggest powers, the U.S. and Russia, have been considerably reduced as the result of negotiations. But we don't often hear about is how about these modern arsenals are more efficient, more accurate, in every way better than those huge arsenals of years past, and how today's weapons, those designed and built in the last couple of decades, are, as one person put it, more for use than for deterrence. What's more, the threat is not only that of a deliberate attack. A report from the Union of Concerned Scientists in April reports that, quoting them, erroneous or ambiguous warnings from U.S. or Russian early warning sensors of an incoming nuclear attack are relatively common, and there have been literally dozens of what the group calls near misses over the years. Despite that, about half of the U.S. nuclear forces remain on hair-trigger alert, a high state of readiness where they have been since the height of the Cold War. Nuclear weapons are very real. They continue to be very real, and the threat they present continues to be very real. And the anniversaries are the only times that they have been used in warfare. Seems an appropriate time to recall that fact. That's it. We're done. We're out of here. We will see you next week. For now, you have the best week you possibly can. And as always, peace.